Hi, my name is Kerry Trella. I'm the Principal Scientist for Rivers and Estuary Science at DBCA, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the Swan-Canning Estuary and its relationship with our dolphin population. So when we think about the estuary, we often tend to think about it in terms of Perth waters or down by the port. And in actual fact, the estuary is made up of two river systems. The Swan River, which is about 67 kilometres long, and the Canning River, which meets the estuary at Canning Bridge and is about 100 kilometres long. And the catchment of those two collective rivers is about 2,000 square kilometres. You can see it in the area in red in this slide. But in actual fact, the Swan River meets the ancient Avon River out in the Swan Valley. And what that means is that because it picks up the Avon River, it connects to that entire catchment of the Avon River as well. So when you combine the two catchments together, we're actually looking at an area of about 125,000 square kilometres. And that's bigger than the size of Tasmania. And it means that all of the water in those lands, and it picks up through the Whadjuk country as well as the Balladong lands and touches on the Uid. All of the water in those lands is making their way downstream through the river systems, down through the estuary and out to the marine environment through Fremantle. So what I want to do today is try to make that connection between what goes on in that catchment and the waterway health and how that relates to dolphins. So let's talk about the dolphins first. We know there are about between 20 and 25 dolphins that frequent the system on a daily or near daily basis. And they come in because it's a place that they choose to live, it's their habitat, but they do so because of the good quality habitats that exist there that support the dolphins in terms of their growth, their survival and their reproduction. And there are a lot of factors that can influence whether a dolphin lives or dies in this system. Individual factors, the overall health of an individual itself, just like with humans, we all differ. The population factors, how viable and how genetically healthy the population itself is. Predation is a really big factor, and you can see there the dolphin on the right-hand side has a scar on its back from where it was bitten by what we think was probably a tiger shark, and it's recovering from those wounds. Diseases is also an important factor for the dolphins. We saw in 2009 and 2019 the advent of a morbillivirus that came in and affected a large proportion of the dolphins that frequented the waterway. Interactions with humans is another important factor in terms of their survival. Boat strikes can be a problem. Fishing line can be a problem. You can see a dolphin entangled there on the right-hand side. And then the availability of food resources and habitat. These two things are kind of connected, and that's where I want to spend the majority of this presentation. So what do dolphins eat? So I've grabbed this image just off the internet. It's an image of the 4 different groups of key things that we know that dolphins might consume, and we certainly see a lot of evidence of them in our waterway consuming the fish and crustaceans, but they'll also eat squid and jellyfish. So what is in the system in terms of fish? Well, we know there are about 209 different species in the Swan-Canning, and that's based on good quality data that we have that's been collected through Murdoch University. 2 species that we know that the dolphins tend to like to eat are the flathead mullet and bream. These species behave differently in our system. The flathead mullet is a marine opportunist. So it breeds off the coast and it makes its way, the juveniles make their way into the system where they'll fatten up, they'll grow, and once they get to a certain size, they'll make their way back out to the marine environment. The bream, on the other hand, live their entire life cycle in the Swan-Canning Estuary. So they will breed to the adult stage, reproduce and then grow and breed again. So they're not going back out to the marine environments. Similar kind of situation with some of the invertebrates that live in the system that we know are of interest to the dolphins. So we know there are 2 different species of prawns in the system, and the kingies are a bit like those mullet. They're a marine opportunist species. So they'll breed up in the marine environment, enter the waterway, get nice and fat, and then leave the system on the good winter flows. Schoolies, the western school prawn, on the other hand, is a smaller species and it lives its entire life cycle of the system. The different types of species that we see and their distribution and their abundance are affected by a couple of really big drivers in the system. It's affected by the sea level influence, the sea level and its influence into the waterway on the tidal cycle, and also influenced by the catchment drivers, the amount of rainfall and stream flow that we get coming down through the catchment. And these waters intermix within the estuary itself and will influence both the species distribution and their abundance. Here's probably an example of how that can change in any one year. So on the left-hand side there, you can see that circle that I put there is these are salinity concentration in the waterway in July of 2013. This was a low rainfall year. You can see the rainfall in the bottom graph. Really, really low rainfall year. This is July, so midwinter, and you can see saline water, the colouring on that salinity plot, is pushing 50 kilometres upstream into the system in the middle of July. Completely different situation in 2021 in the system where we got really significant freshwater flows, and again you can see that annual flow just down the bottom is 2021. A lot of flow coming through that year, and really the marine influence through winter in that year didn't go any more than about 10 kilometres upstream. You can see that brown colouring on that graph is indication of fresh water coming downstream and going all the way down through the port and out to Fremantle. So the types of species, their abundance is influenced by those two really big drivers, but those food resources are also influenced by other factors, and they are particularly vulnerable to nutrients and organic loading in the system. And this diagram just represents a catchment and the dynamics within that catchment. So within this diagram, what we're trying to show here is that a little bit of nutrient coming into the system is actually important in terms of driving the food web in the system. So a little bit of nutrients drives a little bit of plant growth, which is food for invertebrates, which is food for small fish, which is then food for bigger fish, and then food for dolphins. But when we get too many nutrients in our system, we tend to start to see problems. As that nutrient and organic loading is too abundant, and when I talk about nutrients, I'm referring to nitrogen and phosphorus as key drivers of algal growth in the system. And when we get too much of these nutrients coming off the catchment, we tend to see the influence of abundant algal growth in the system and too much algae. And I'm just going to show you two examples of that. On the left-hand side there, we can see an overabundance of macroalgae. It's accumulating on the shoreline. It's been taken away. And on the right-hand side, we can see an overabundance of microalgae in the system. Now, we don't often see it as bad as this. This is a quite extreme situation. You can't generally see microalgae in the system. It gives it a little bit of a green colour or a little bit of a brown colour, but we don't generally see it. This is a really extreme example on the right-hand side. But when either of these macroalgae or microalgae are too abundant, what can happen is that they boom, so they bloom and boom, and then they bust. And when they bust, they sink to the bottom of the system, they soak up oxygen as they decay, and that oxygen then gets taken out of the water and is no longer available for fish. And so we can end up with fish kills as a result, or fish moving out of the system as a result. And here's a really good example of how bad low oxygen can get in the system. This is if you can just focus on the middle plot there. It's just showing extremely low oxygen, anoxic conditions in the red there, in an area of about 20 to 25 kilometres through the system of absolutely no oxygen top to bottom. And this is a kind of extreme situation we don't like to see in our waterway because it's not great for fish and it's not great for invertebrates. And in the long run, if this kind of thing would persist, it certainly wouldn't be good for dolphins either. In terms of reduction in food resources. This is back in 2008, and since then, certainly in these zones of the river, which are probably more vulnerable to these kinds of events, in these upper zones, we've seen the implementation of 2 oxygenation plants to reduce oxygen stress. So I mentioned that getting too many nutrients into the system is a problem. So some clever people back in 2009 determined through some modelling work that in order to try and protect the water quality of the system and therefore the habitats and the resources within it, we needed to get nutrients coming into the system down by about 50%. Now, not all of the nutrients were coming in through the Avon catchment and the farmers, so it certainly wasn't an issue just restricted to farmers. You can see there the coastal catchments were contributing a lot of nutrients into the system, proportional to the size of the catchment. So, but the big take-home message was needed to get it down by 50%. And to do that, we needed to intervene at the bottom end of the system where there were too many nutrients, but try and reduce them out on the landscape, the amount of nutrients coming in, and intercept them as they came through the waterway. And certainly there was a lot of work that has been done and continues to be done through catchment management groups, NRM groups, government and local government, working together to try and reduce nutrients coming to the system. And what we've seen, so results in quite recently, is showing that since over the last 10 years or so, we've seen nutrients go down by about 20%. So it's still a long way to go from that 50% preferential amount, but there has been some level of improvement, of reduction in nutrients coming down through the catchments. We're not necessarily seeing that translate to a reduction of nutrients in the estuary itself. And this is a fairly complicated plot, but basically it's just showing total nitrogen as an example, the amount of nutrient concentration in the estuary through the system, and it's showing there in the different seasons. And you can see that we're still above the targets that we're setting, and in some years we see a really big increase in that, usually associated with really, really high rainfall years connecting the catchments. It's not all bad news though. This is a plot that's just showing harmful algae and fish kills. So some algae is more harmful than others. And you can see there the fish kills that we see over time. And we've seen a reduction in fish kills, and we've not seen, and we were seeing in the early 2000s really excessive a number of fish kills, large number of fish in the hundreds of thousands. So we're not seeing anything like this today. And it's because over time, even if the number of harmful algal blooms we've seen hasn't declined, but what we have seen is a change in species over time. So we're not seeing as often blooms of this particular algae that I've highlighted there called Carlodinium, which is particularly problematic species which affects the fish's gills. And you see a healthy gill on the left-hand side there, a not so healthy gill affected by this particular algae on the right-hand side. It produces a toxin, it releases the toxin into the system, and that toxin then effectively erodes the fish's gills. So, they then can't breathe. So we're not seeing as much of this algae, and we've seen a decline in the number of fish kills in the system over time. So that's good news. And what we're seeing is that is translating into our fish community index, which is giving us a measure of the health of the fish communities in space and time. And you can see here, we're looking at the nearshore areas for the waterway. And you can see since the early 2000s, we've seen improvements in our fish communities, and they continue at good levels over time. So that's good news, and it's good news for dolphins. So I just want to wrap it up there just by saying that we know that the fish and invertebrates are really important food resources for our dolphins. We know that those food resources have the potential to be impacted by water quality, that nitrogen and phosphorus, those nutrients, are a problem in our system that we need to resolve, and that we've seen some improvements, some reduction in those over time, but we're not out of the woods, and that the river system can use your help. So the way, as good stewards of the waterway and people who care about dolphins, who care about the food resources that might be available to them, there are ways that you can help to try and reduce the nutrient load coming into the system. And these are by really reducing the amount of fertiliser that's going onto your gardens, because the fertilisers can make their way through the soils into the drainage network and then ultimately into the estuary. So the way that you can help is by minimising your lawn areas and growing local plants, and also improving your soils. And if you do those three things, you don't need as many nutrients going into your gardens in the first place. If you do need to fertilise and you really want to, then please look for Fertilise Wise endorsed fertilisers that are on the shelves, and only fertilise when you need to. So you certainly don't need to fertilise this unless the plants are showing signs that they need fertilising, and that's shown by yellowing. And also think about only applying them when the plants are actively growing. So that's going to be through your warm periods in spring and early autumn, and certainly don't fertilise in winter because the rains will just wash it into the soil, and if those soils don't retain those nutrients, they'll wash straight into the drainage lines and make their ways to the estuary. So that's how you can help, the estuary and the dolphins and the fish resources will appreciate the efforts that we can collectively achieve as a community.